In business today, 3 things to know. First, imminent threat. The White House launches a military strike in Syria against ISIS and another terrorist group that it says was planning a major attack. Why now and how much more to come? Then, the greening of the United Nations. President Obama outlines his plan for sustainable energy and the effort to get the rest of the world on board. They listened, but which countries are willing to act? And stop at the border. The administration announces new rules for so-called tax inversions aimed at stopping U.S. companies from fleeing the country. But critics are asking, why not just change the corporate tax code? Arise Exchange starts now. Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Schmertz. President Obama took action against a new threat today, a terrorist group known as Khorasan. He says he authorized immediate and decisive military action because Khorasan represents an immediate and imminent threat to the homeland. Mr. Obama made the statement in explaining how the U.S. did not go it alone in launching missile strikes last night against ISIS targets in Syria. Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and Qatar all played roles in the airstrikes. In all, the U.S. fired 47 Tomahawk missiles, including 7 at Khorasan, with targets including fighters, training centers, trucks, and finance centers. This morning, the president spoke about the political support he has at home.
I've spoken to leaders in Congress, and I'm pleased that there is bipartisan support for the actions that we're taking. America is always stronger when we stand united, and that unity sends a powerful message to the world that we will do what's necessary to defend our country.
Our Washington correspondent James Blue is here in New York, joins us with an update. James, what is Khorasan and why have we not heard of them until today?
Khorasan is the baddest of the bad. These are the sort of most conservative and most sort of outrageous members of the Pakistani Taliban. They were first mentioned in public in an LA Times article back in July. And I don't know if you remember this summer, there was a heightened air security threat or warning, and that was because of Khorasan. Khorasan is actively plotting to strike at the U.S. and other Western targets.
So I thought we've been told that ISIS was the baddest of the bad. This is sort of the terrorist version of Big Brother. I mean, they seem to keep getting worse and worse.
Well, ISIS is certainly bad, and they have waged a very effective media campaign, and so ISIS is on everyone's lips. But in terms of what people in sort of security areas are really most worried about, it's Khorasan.
Okay, so obviously the White House knew of Khorasan. What information were they given that they had to act now?
They were under the impression that there was a potentially imminent threat, and the White House has actually stepped back from this. At first, it was an imminent threat. It's now gone to a potentially imminent threat, that there was going to be some action against U.S. targets, possibly a very large action, followed by some smaller actions around the country.
And I guess that's the difference here. As bad as we keep hearing ISIS is, the threat to the homeland, to the United States, wasn't clearly spelled out from ISIS. They were not making direct threats.
ISIS has not made direct threats. They certainly have recruited a number of Americans, a number of Westerners who could travel here and do things in the United States. But clearly, Khorasan, I think, likely had more advanced plans, and apparently there was an action plan that had not yet been activated that the U.S. military and the coalition wanted to disrupt.
Okay, so we took on some action against Khorasan, though most of the missiles fell on ISIS last night. And this was a coalition of quite a few countries. Can you talk to us a little bit about the coalition and how this came to being? Because Qatar is both an ally in this, but they're also on the terrorist list.
Well, I mean, what has happened is that Secretary of State Kerry has gone through the Middle East, hat in hand, getting contributions and getting countries to say, yes, we will do this. Some countries are involved in the kinetic fight. Some countries are only going to get involved in training. And Qatar, which is a very interesting country, officially is part of the coalition, but unofficially, a lot of the support for the efforts have come from Qatari money. And so, in a way, they are playing both sides. sides. The government is certainly only supporting and saying they are supporting the coalition against ISIS, but there are a lot of Qatari dollars.
And real quickly, James, when do we think the next set of hits are going to come? Because there's probably more.
There are more hits. It's likely to happen over the next few nights, overnight, and just stay tuned. Okay. They're coming after them.
Okay. James Wu, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And after speaking in Washington, the president headed to New York to address the United Nations. The topic, climate change. Frank Ucciardo is at the UN in Turtle Bay with today's General Assembly News, which hosted the Climate Summit of 2014. Frank.
Andrew, you know, the president almost eclipsed his UN climate change speech here at the United Nations today with the airstrikes in Syria. But once he got on the stage here at the world body, he called for global cooperation, saying that no one can face this global threat, no one nation can face this global threat alone.
Just a few minutes ago, I met with Chinese Vice Premier Zhang Li and reiterated my belief that as the two largest economies and emitters in the world, we have a special responsibility to lead. That's what big nations have to do. In each country, there is a suspicion that if we act and other countries don't, that we will be at an economic disadvantage. But we have to lead. That is what the United Nations and this General Assembly is about.
So, Frank, what here is the president specifically recommending?
Well, one of the things that was interesting today is he was calling upon the smaller developing nations to not make the mistakes that the bigger industrialized nations have made, like the United States. He took responsibility for the mistakes that have been made in America, and he said, as you're developing your industries, we want you, to pay attention and, go green, make sure you're not doing what a lot of the big gas emitters have done, including the U.S., China, countries like that, and India, Andrew.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before. The United States is arguably one of the worst offenders here. Is there any sort of pushback from other nations basically saying, don't tell us what to do after you spent, a century and a half polluting most of the world?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and from an economic standpoint, there's a lot of people that have a bone to pick with the U.S. here because they happen to be the biggest deadbeat at the United Nations. They owe nearly $1 billion in dues to the UN. So people are saying, why are you telling us what to do? Because you haven't paid your dues for 2 years. Their annual assessment is about $621 million a year. They haven't stepped up to the plate to even pay for being here. So, from that standpoint, people are kind of scratching their head and saying, okay, are you going to pay for cooperation? And that's some of the pushback I've actually heard in the halls.
Yeah, you would think that they would at least revoke our parking spots at the UN by now. What is on the agenda tomorrow at the UN?
Okay, tomorrow, of course, is the big day, the big start of the debate. Everybody's waiting to hear what President Obama is going to say when he starts his speech tomorrow morning. He's one of the first lead-off speakers, within the first three, in fact. And everybody's going to want to hear what he's going to put in that speech that has to do with the airstrikes in Syria. I mean, that wasn't on the table before, but now that it is, everybody's going to want to know, okay, what's the next step? The Syrian ambassador here today at the United Nations said to me that, okay, I was informed by the U.S. representative, so we were told before the airstrikes. So they've been very quiet about that, but the world body wants to see exactly where the U.S. is going to go on the subject of terrorism, and that's going to be a big part of the speech. Of course, he's also expected to talk about the Ebola outbreak and what the U.S. is doing there to contribute to the effort.
Frank Ucciardo at the United Nations, thank you so much. Markets fell sharply again today on news of home prices and worry about all these overseas developments. According to the Federal Housing Finance Agency, prices rose by just 0.1% in July. That's less than 0.5% expected by economists. But U.S. manufacturing hovered near a 4.5-year high in September. For the Dow and S&P 500, it is a third straight day of losses. Let's take a look at the final numbers. The Dow Jones Industrial Average down triple digits, 116.68 to 17,056. The S&P 500 sliding by 11.5, and the Nasdaq down 19. Some of the top stocks we're watching today. Herbalife rebounded from a huge tanking on rumors that activist investor Carl Icahn may pull his stake in the company. The stock fell 10% late yesterday afternoon on speculation that Herbalife, that Icon may get out of Herbalife. Herbalife did close up 10% today, though. AbbVie's sealed deal to buy Irish drug maker Shire for $55 billion may be in hot water. New regulations put into effect by the Obama administration that we're going to talk about later in the show may put the acquisition in jeopardy. That relates to tax inversion. AbbVie down $1.15. And Apple is said to be shutting down the Beats music streaming service it acquired in May. However, Apple late in the day has denied that report. Apple closing up $1.58 to $102.64. And taking a look at commodities, gold up 5.10 and oil up 70 cents to 91.57. Coming up, we'll talk with Peter Cardillo about the economic news, and the White House plans to curb so-called tax inversions, and corporate America responds. You're watching Arise Exchange. Last week on Arise Exchange, will Janet Yellen spring any surprises on the markets when it comes to interest rates?
The market is worried that if they raise rates too soon, you might kill the recovery.
President Obama pledged to send 3,000 troops to West Africa to fight Ebola. Kanye West demanded all the fans attending a concert in Sydney stand.
I can't do the rest of the show until everybody stand up.
One was in a wheelchair. The other had a prosthetic leg. Watch this week for more. Arise Exchange. Welcome back to Arise Exchange. Peter Cardillo, Chief Market Economist at Rockwell Global Capitals, back here on Exchange to talk about the latest economic news and the markets. Peter, welcome back. We have this little bit September swoon going on. Some are saying this is a good thing, that we need a little bit of a pullback, take some of the air out of the market.
Absolutely, I agree with that. This market from a technical perspective is certainly overbought, and we really haven't seen a pullback of 4 or 5%. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's going to happen this time around, but I think as we wait for the third quarter results, the market is going to continue to pull back, and I think that it has nothing to do with the fundamentals, but purely a technical pullback, which can be underlined as healthy going forward.
Yeah, you say it has nothing to do with the fundamentals, so we shouldn't read too much in about somewhat of the mixed economic news and certainly what's going on overseas. I mean, that airstrikes used to spook the markets, and today,
Well, what airstrikes are we talking about? We're talking about an airstrike that's been coordinated with our partners, especially Middle Eastern partners. The EU is on board about potential airstrikes by their, joining the U.S. And we're targeting terrorism. It's not like we're targeting a situation that we're trying to maybe unravel a government or something to that effect. We're basically fighting a united front here.
And so then maybe the markets feel pretty
And
comfortable
so I think that's really a plus for the market, not a negative.
So on the technical question then, if we had sort of hit the tie point on the technical on the high end, where do you see support level for the markets then?
I think first support level is probably 1775 on the S&P. Good chance of us maybe breaching that and moving to the 1750 area, which would actually be more of a healthier correction. But again, I don't want to call this a correction. I just want to say it's a pullback and something that we need.
Okay, so you look at some of the economic news out there from a fundamental standpoint. Is there anything that is spooking the markets now going forward? If we had a poor August unemployment number and then some decent weekly numbers, and we know the weekly numbers don't mean a whole lot. I guess it's the September unemployment number that everyone is watching, and both we don't want it to be too good or too bad or too hot or too cold.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that, the story of the employment market growing has been basically in neutral gear right now. It hasn't been too hot, not too cold, creating enough of jobs. And I think, the bottom line is that we don't have any wage pressures accompanying any new jobs creation or jobs that are out there, the jobs that are offering employees,
we see a lot of the seasonal jobs coming in. Is that going to tip the unemployment numbers and possibly, give us a misnomer of where those are heading?
No, not yet. Are you referring to the upcoming holiday season? No, I think it's a little too early for that. Maybe in the next month's report, obviously. But again, jobs creation has been selective, and it's mostly been in the service sector,
which is low wages.
Yeah, and they're not. Most of these service sectors are not high-paying jobs, and so I think it's safe to say that. Yeah, we would like to see jobs creation of 250,000 plus, but I don't think 175 to 200,000 average on a monthly basis is all that negative.
Okay, Peter Cardillo, thank you as always.
My pleasure.
Time now for our business ticker stories making headlines across the nation and the world. The latest forecasts on the toll from the Ebola epidemic in West Africa are growing more dire. The World Health Organization says the number of Ebola infections could triple by November. A report released from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control estimates that the outbreak could infect as many now as 1.4 million people by January. The whistleblower jackpot has never been bigger. An anonymous foreigner who tipped off the government about insider trading will receive a $30 million award for sounding the alarm. That's the largest award ever doled out by the SEC as part of its whistleblower incentives recently created by Congress. Toys R Us plans to get a lot of Santa's helpers together this winter. The toy retailer says it will hire 45,000 seasonal employees across the U.S. This will more than double the company's existing workforce. Toys R Us is just one company ramping up for the holiday season. Others that have said they'll expand for the holidays include UPS, Target, Kohl's, Walmart, and FedEx. And Liberia is receiving a big incentive to stop chopping down trees. Norway has agreed to give Liberia $150 million in development aid to stop deforestation. Logging is rampant in Liberia since the president handed out permits to cut down 58% of the country's remaining rainforest. And if you think last call is something you only hear in a bar, check out this bakery. A place called Prohibition Bakery on New York's Lower East Side has launched a series of liquor-laced cupcakes. The confections are infused with alcohol after they've been baked. So now you can get a cupcake flavored like an old-fashioned, beer, or sangria. Nice. The bakery asks that you please eat responsibly. It's been a busy week at the White House. Domestically, the president took action to curb what is known as tax inversions. That's when a U.S. company merges with a foreign company and moves its corporate registration to avoid some U.S. taxes. We saw that with a bunch of companies recently. But while Mr. Obama and the Treasury Department have stated new rules, some are asking, why not simply change the corporate tax rate, already one of the world's highest? Gerald Celente, publisher of Trades Journal and a forecasting trend journal, joins us by phone. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you.
All right, so this is a complicated issue, obviously. So walk us through a little bit about what the Obama administration did yesterday.
Well, what they did was they're making it a bit more difficult for these companies to engage in this so-called inversion. And that really means moving their legal headquarters to lower tax countries. So that was the first step that happened. And I think what really precipitated it was this latest one with Burger King and Tim Hortons. It was a cross-border deal up in Canada.
Yeah.
And this has been building. So it looks, they're attempting to take actions to stop this from happening.
And Gerald, late today, Burger King says nothing is going to stand in the way of this deal, or at least the decision made yesterday. But do you get a sense that going forward, companies are going to sort of rethink this strategy? I mean, was this draconian enough, if you will, for companies to rethink?
Oh, not at all draconian enough. Actually, even when you hear the words from people like Senator Charles Schumer, he said it wasn't tough enough as well. So, according to those who want stricter protections against these companies going overseas, this is more, I would say, smoke than action.
And you think more basically than a little bit of a political statement? I mean, it is questions as to how much the U.S. Treasury can do on its own anyway, and Congress is certainly not going to act.
Right. Senator Orrin Hatch made that very clear, that the real litigations, the real lines are going to be drawn from Congress, and you're right, that's not going to happen. But let's look where we are. We're coming up to the midterm elections, and every election, a national election, they always talk about we have to have a level playing field, and we can't give those multinationals a break when all of us are paying our fair share. So that's why I say this is really a lot of a political move as well. Yes, it's going to have a dampening effect to some extent, but the big guys are going to be able to play around it.
That's what I've always said. These tax inversions, benefit large corporations. Smaller companies really can't do this, right? The mom and pop shop running something on the street corner can't merge with his neighbor in Canada.
Exactly. That's why I'm saying it's a good political issue.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, they're not going to do anything. Mm-hmm. This will slow down some action. It'll put some movements on hold. But when they really want to make it happen, like Burger King and Tim Hortons said today, they're going to make it happen.
And also, by the way, we're not talking about a large amount of tax money here, are we? I mean, there's an argument, as you know, critics say, simply lower the corporate tax rate, not radical. I mean, they do it in Europe, France, England, for example, lower tax rates than the United States.
Yes, well, they're looking about this tax aversion costing upwards of probably about $20 billion in 10 years, which in the scheme of things isn't, it's not big dough, in a multi-trillion-dollar economy.
This is true.
So, again, this is a great political issue, and when you look at the details of it, it's not going to have that much of an impact on the inversion markets.
Gerald, Celente, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I had a Facebook status update for our favorite person of the day. You're watching Arise Exchange.
If I was building my own network, it would be for the people, by the people. It would be very diverse. It would be with every culture you can think of.
If I was to start my own news network, it would reflect positive and negative within the continents and the countries around the world.
I think that I would be more looking towards young people.
If I were to build my own news network, it would look like New York City. Old, young, fresh, hip, classic.
If I was to build my own news network, I would just have people from all over who are very connected and diverse.
If I was to build my own news network, my own world network, I would love a correspondent in every country, every location, every city. I mean, it's kind of unrealistic, but how cool would it be to get local stories from the impoverished country, the impoverished city that we don't know about?
Arise News, every culture, every angle.
Time now for our favorite person of the day, when we pick one person who grabbed our attention, not for the right reasons. We start with one famous name. Mark Zuckerberg is spending $10 million to refurbish a 1920s home in San Francisco's Dolores Heights district. Some are calling it Fort Zuckerberg, and the massive undertaking is ruffling some hipster feathers. First, there are no parking signs, or no parking signs have been put up that block other homeowners from parking outside their own home. Second, the construction workers are tearing up a block of sidewalk that runs to the new home, and there's round-the-clock security. Some of the things that Mark and his wife are spending on: $720,000 for a new office and media room, $25,000 to make the fourth floor livable, and another $750,000 for landscaping. At least the place will look good. It's reported there have been 40 to 50 workers on site in the neighborhood every day since April of 2013. So Mark Zuckerberg, who once famously lived in a small apartment while he ran Facebook, is our favorite person of the day. Coming up, turning around our troubled cities here on Arise Exchange. Global. It's Monday, so it must be time for a new round of sanctions against Russia. Nigeria is open for business, and you are getting a handle on this situation. Compelling. Time for liquid lunch, things that make us want to drink. Could she have been separated at birth from, say, Grimace? All business.
Money's coming out of these countries, and that flow is part of what's driving the equity markets.
Entertaining money daily.
It's about reimagining.
Arise Exchange. You've heard a lot about Detroit. It is not, however, the only city in the U.S. that is struggling financially. More than 13 million Americans live in declining cities, and that number is rising. Here to talk more about the cities in crisis is Edward Poteat. He is president of Carthage Advisors, an affordable housing real estate firm, and he is author of The Fiscal Cliff, the financial crisis facing American cities. It's an honor to have you on this program. Thank you so much. We hear a lot about Detroit, but give us an overview of what other cities you think are financially in trouble.
Newark is one of them. Chicago is another one. There are cities that have some structural issues, fiscal structural issues, and this is just going to keep on snowballing. That my book talks about that Detroit is the tip of the iceberg, and it really is. That this is a slow-moving iceberg that's going to impact a lot of different.
Even though we're
cities.
starting to see the economy come back a little bit, we're still seeing some cities on the brink. And I know Moody's has a bunch of cities that have lowered their credit ratings to junk, for example.
Exactly.
So you're thinking that this is going to spread. What got these cities into trouble?
That's a good question. Cities, the deindustrialization of this country and globalism, is something that sounds sexy, but what that meant was jobs that were in our cities are now in other countries.
Yeah, okay, that's true. And Detroit obviously lost a lot of industry. But Pittsburgh is an example of a city that was an industry city and has absolutely created a renaissance there now.
I wouldn't say absolutely, but that you are right, that there are certain cities like New York City was an industrial city which has been able to come back. But Detroit's a special example. It was a one industry town. So when it lost that industry, that it had nothing. Baltimore, another example. But really, it's cities that are losing population.
And Detroit is an example of that. People have completely left Detroit. In fact, for some time, there has been a flight of the middle class to the suburbs.
Exactly.
And Detroit did nothing to stop that.
Exactly. That city in 1950 had 2 million people. Now it has 800,000.
What about the role of government here? And there's lack of a tax base, but there is also the issue of how much city employees are getting and pensions. The pensions are really becoming, and pension liabilities are becoming a real challenge.
Right. That is a situation happening within a lot of cities.
Yeah.
Mayor Rahm Emanuel from Chicago is fighting their unions now, trying to fix that. It's also something that's going to impact potentially New York City, not to such a large extent, because New York City is a wealthier city. But these are all fixed costs that cities can no longer afford.
It's interesting you talk about New York City because I heard the comment that Mayor de Blasio, our rather progressive mayor here, who has started a lot of programs that people like, is betting on New York's economy simply continuing to grow because he's done the numbers himself. Is that the problem that some of the cities in the past have gotten into?
The biggest problem, and not to sound like a broken record, is lost population.
Yeah. So how does a city, because Mike Bloomberg was in Detroit recently, and he said, we can turn Detroit around. So how do we do that?
You have to take care of some of the structural issues. You have a city which was built for 2 million people that now has 800,000 people. So there's all this vacant housing, vacant schools, vacant sewer lines. That costs money, and that's wasted money. So somehow it's figuring out this lost infrastructure and lowering those costs so that the cities can be stable.
Detroit obviously filed for bankruptcy. 2 questions. One, is the bankruptcy going to help Detroit? And the second is, are other cities going to benefit from filing bankruptcy?
No city will benefit from them filing from bankruptcy. City debt, municipal debt, is not worth what it was even 5 years ago, given some of these issues with Detroit filing bankruptcy. Is it going to help that city? We hope so. Those structural issues are still going to be there, but if it can file bankruptcy, it's going to be even worse because those cuts would have to be even more dramatic than they are now.
What about cities that we talk about the industrial sector kind of moving out? But there are parts of this country, if you actually look overall, the U.S. has brought more industry back. There's more manufacturing happening now than there was 10 years ago. Where are those going to, and why would a city that already has the infrastructure, why couldn't it take advantage of that? What are the cities that are taking advantage of it that makes a difference?
Sure. Even when manufacturing's coming back, it's highly automated. So that a job or a function which took 10 people now takes 1. It's still not creating jobs the way that were created before World War II and in the 50s and 60s, where there were a lot of people working in factories. That's really a question.
And you need the people because they then go out
with.
and spend money elsewhere.
Exactly.
Okay, so what are some of the tips that you say the cities should start pursuing?
Twofold. One is immigration, and it sounds backwards, but if immigrants want to come to this country, let them come, but let them populate areas that need population, like a Detroit, like a Baltimore.
That's really
like
interesting. We're running out of time, but we don't really hear much about that as an immigration policy. Okay,
right.
Come, but we're going to put you in certain places.
Right. Right.
That's actually very fascinating. We should bring you back to talk about that a little bit more. Edward Poteat, the author of The Fiscal Cliff, the Financial Crisis Facing American Cities. Thank you so much. It's a fascinating topic, and there's going to be a lot more to talk about.
Appreciate it.
Tomorrow on the Rise Exchange, we will be covering the United Nations once again, the opening debate. Let's take a look at the final numbers. Markets once again in red across the board. I'm Andrew Schmertz. Thanks for watching the Rise Exchange. We will see you tomorrow. Stay right there. Sorry about that, my microphone.